On the night of November 3, 1842, the Givens plantation sat under the still, heavy air of a mobile autumn, the kind of silence that hangs before a storm or a confession. Inside the main house, where oil lamps flickered and portraits of ancestors stared from gold frames, a dinner was being served. The master of the estate, Elias Givens, had returned from town in his carriage at dusk, carrying with him the smell of bourbon and the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. His wife, Elizabeth, poured wine with a trembling hand that no one seemed to notice. According to a coroner's ledger recovered from Mobile County, one of the few surviving entries from that year, Elias was found slumped forward upon the table, complexion darkened, foam at the lips, 'cause undetermined. The ledger bears no signature, only an initial. Some believe those letters belonged to the man who served the final meal, Samuel, Elias's enslaved valet. The details come to us fractured, burned around the edges of time. But from what remains we can reconstruct the scene. A plate of roasted quail. A glass of claret wine poured twice. A wife in black silk. A servant who did not eat. And somewhere in that moment between sip and silence, between heartbeat and collapse, history broke open. An excerpt from the Mobile Register, November 5, 1842 reads, "Sudden death has struck the household of the late Elias Givens, esteemed planter of the Bay frontier. No foul play is suspected. The widow remains in private mourning." But private mourning soon turned to rumor. In letters exchanged between planters' wives, fragments found decades later in the attic of a decaying mansion in Baldwin County, there are hints of something unspeakable. One woman wrote, "She dined with death itself and did not flinch." Another, "The colored man remained by her side." Some say he wept, others say he smiled. The county records tell us that within 3 days, the body was buried without ceremony, the will unsealed, and the plantation sealed off from visitors. No inquest followed. No charges filed. Only silence, a silence thick enough to swallow generations. But why would a woman of standing risk everything for the company of a man she was raised to own? Why would she choose ruin, shame, and the noose over a life of Southern comfort? The surviving estate inventory lists 47 enslaved people, valued collectively at $12,000. Line 17 reads, "Samuel, male 29 years, carpenter, valued at $800. That is all the system recorded of the man who may have altered the course of a dynasty. No age beyond approximation, no family listed, no history, just a name, a price, and a silence. Yet, in the parish death register, one marginal note appears in different ink, likely added years later by another hand, Elizabeth Givens, widow. Later joined to Samuel Givens, colored. No date. No signature. Just a statement that should not exist. If this union did occur, it would have violated every law of Alabama and every unwritten law of the antebellum South. It was, in essence, treason of the flesh. Marriage between a white widow and a formerly enslaved man was not only unthinkable, it was erasure in waiting. And so, the story vanishes. The newspaper that first mentioned Elias's death was later found with that issue torn out. The courthouse where the will was stored burned in 1846, destroying all probate files for that decade. Even the plantation ledgers, which once detailed every ounce of cotton and every whip's tally, end abruptly that winter. It is as though Mobile itself decided to forget. But whispers survive where ink does not. In oral histories collected a century later from descendants of those who once labored the Givens fields, an old woman recalled a tale told by her grandmother. The missus freed her man. Said she loved him. Said the devil took her husband for what he did. Was it love that drove them? Vengeance? Or simply the final desperate grasp at freedom by two souls bound by law and circumstance? In the South of 1842, love between master and enslaved was always a crime. But for Elizabeth and Samuel, it became something even more dangerous. A legend too human to survive the record books. And yet, here we are more than a century later, still chasing their shadows through burnt pages and rumors whispered down through bloodlines. If you've ever heard the name Givens whispered in your family line, if your grandmother told you about a night never spoken of again, write it below. Because every comment, every memory, every name, brings another story like this back into the light. The Givens plantation spread across 1,200 acres of rich Alabama soil, low country earth that swallowed the footsteps of generations and gave back only cotton, salt, and blood. The land itself seemed to breathe under the weight of history. To the west lay the slow, silted waters of the Tensas River, and to the east, a line of cypress trees marking the boundary where the estate met the wilderness. Every morning, mist would rise from the fields like the ghosts of those who had toiled there, vanishing only when the overseer's horn sounded at first light. According to the 1840 agricultural census of Mobile County, Elias Givens reported owning 1,178 acres, producing 400 bales of cotton, 3,000 bushels of corn, and maintaining 62 enslaved persons. His estate was listed among the top 10 in productivity, a symbol of prosperity in the Alabama Black Belt. But prosperity in those ledgers came at the cost of human lives, reduced to numbers scrawled in ink beside tallies of livestock and grain. The main house, 2 stories of whitewashed timber and Greek Revival columns, stood on a rise overlooking the quarters. Its symmetry was deliberate, meant to impose order on a world built on terror. Behind it stretched the slave cabins, narrow single-room shacks with dirt floors, built from discarded planks. A traveler passing through Mobile in 1841, one Reverend A.P. Washburn wrote in his journal, "The houses of the servants are arranged like pens for cattle, their inhabitants marked with an obedience that is not peace but fear." Life on the Givens plantation was ruled by precision and punishment. The overseer, Thomas Breedwell, maintained strict records. His diary, one of the few fragments to survive, details everything from crop yields to lash counts. On June 14, 1842, he recorded, 3 lashes before sunrise to set the tone. 1 runaway girl returned. Punishment deferred till Sabbath Eve. His handwriting is steady, almost elegant, as if cruelty were merely administration. Each day began before dawn. Field hands, mostly men and older children, moved through rows of cotton until dusk. Women tended to domestic labor, cooking, sewing, caring for the master's children. Infants were left in baskets at the edge of the fields, crying into the wind. Food rations, cornmeal, molasses, and salted pork, were measured weekly, cut short as discipline for imagined disobedience. The nights belonged to exhaustion but also to something else, quiet resistance. Enslaved people met in secret beneath the magnolia grove, whispering hymns that carried double meanings. Songs like "Steal Away" and "Wade in the Water" echoed softly through the pines, part prayer, part code. In those verses lay the only freedom they could claim, the freedom to remember who they were before the ledgers. According to oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration nearly a century later, descendants from the region recalled stories of the Givens place as cursed ground. One former resident, identified only as Annie G., told her interviewer, "They said you could still hear the cries in the fog. Said the earth there never took seed right after the old master died." Folklore has a way of remembering what records try to forget. In the parlor, Elizabeth Givens played the piano, her music floating through open windows and drifting down to the fields. Some said she played hymns, others mournful waltzes. To those working below, her notes were both torment and hope, a reminder of a world beyond their reach and a hint that she too might be trapped within her own kind of cage. Every structure on that plantation served a purpose in maintaining control. The whip, the ledger, the church sermon, all conspired to teach obedience. The law, too, stood firmly on the side of ownership. In Alabama's Slave Code of 1833, Section 7 stated, "No person of African descent, bond or free, shall testify against any white person in any court of law." In practice, it meant that every truth spoken by the enslaved vanished the moment it was uttered. And yet, within that silence, something grew, a pressure, invisible but gathering. The soil beneath the Givens fields had absorbed too much pain, too many secrets. The cotton grew tall, but it grew over graves. Each harvest, each bale shipped downriver to Mobile Bay, carried with it the weight of those buried without markers, remembered only by the trees. By the fall of 1842, the air on the plantation had turned electric. There were whispers of rebellion, of spirits restless beneath the magnolias. Overseer Breedwell noted in his diary, "The hands appear unsettled. Songs at night sound darker now. Must enforce stricter discipline." But what he called unrest was only the sound of something inevitable. Because even in the most ordered world of chains and columns, even under the weight of 1,000 lashes and 1,000 silences, there comes a night when order breaks, and the soil remembers what it's owed. In the brittle light of history, they exist only as entries, inked across yellowed paper, stripped of faces, stripped of voices. Samuel, age approximately 29. Carpenter. Valued at $800. Beneath him, Dinah, washerwoman, age 24 with child. Value $500. These lines appear on the estate inventory of Elias Givens, 1842, a document miraculously spared from the courthouse fire that erased most mobile records of that decade. To a clerk they were numbers. To the soil beneath the Givens plantation they were roots. Samuel was born not on that land but on a smaller estate upriver, sold at age 12 after his mother, an enslaved woman named Nora, was accused of insolence. The bill of sale, recorded in February 1825, lists her crime simply as talking back. No further explanation. Nora vanished from the records that same year. Some say she was sent to Louisiana. Others whisper she took her own life in the river before the trader's wagon left. Samuel's early years were spent in labor, shaping wood and stone. He learned carpentry from an older man named Jonas, who taught him to build with quiet rebellion, carving secret marks into beams and door frames, symbols that meant protection, resistance, endurance. When Elias purchased him in 1838, the receipt read, "One Negro male of uncommon strength and skill, fit for domestic service." Samuel's fate shifted from the fields to the house, where obedience was meant to appear more polished but never less binding. Inside those walls, Samuel became invisible and indispensable. He repaired staircases, built cradles, mended the master's chair. The same hands that shaped the architecture of comfort also built the instruments of captivity: lockboxes, harnesses, whipping posts. In a diary fragment from overseer Thomas Breedwell, one chilling line survives: Samuel's work precise as ever. No sentiment, just craft. But history often misreads silence. For the enslaved, silence was never emptiness, it was armor. Samuel's stillness, his obedience, his measured words, all were tools of survival. And somewhere within that restraint, an understanding grew between him and Elizabeth. Whether it began as pity, as rebellion, or as something deeper, the record offers no clarity. Only a hint: a church ledger from St. Augustine's parish, dated April 1840, listing the baptism of a boy of mixed parentage, unnamed, born to a woman called Dinah. The margin bears faint initials, H, in a hand that could be the widow's or the master's. If the child was Samuel's kin, the bloodline becomes a labyrinth, crossing the forbidden boundaries of race, ownership, and paternity that define Southern life. It is impossible to know the full truth. But the echoes remain. Oral histories collected a century later from descendants along the Mobile Tensaw Delta tell of a brown-skinned boy with green eyes, who grew up free on a fishing boat, taught by a man named Sam. Folklore or fact, the difference is often just a matter of whose name the archive allowed to live. In the quarters, family was fluid but sacred. Bonds were forged not by law but by shared survival. Marriages took place beneath the trees, away from white eyes. Pieces of cloth tied around wrists, songs sung low, prayers whispered into each other's palms. When a man or woman was sold, others would carry their names in memory, repeating them so the world would not forget. It was an act of defiance, a genealogy spoken aloud when writing was forbidden. Among the fragments left behind from the Givens estate, there is one curious item: a small wooden carving found during an excavation near the original slave cabins in the 1970s. A bird, roughly hewn, wings spread. On its base, carved letters barely visible, S to D. Perhaps Samuel's hand, perhaps not. But the initials align with the names on the ledger: Samuel and Dinah. It is the only piece of evidence that hints at love on that land before the tragedy to come. The ledger keeps their names orderly, static, confined to columns and currency. But to walk those grounds now, to feel the soil crumble beneath your boots, is to know that the people listed there did not live neatly. They loved, they bled, they prayed, they resisted. The ink lies, the land does not. By the fall of 1842, the family that once survived through whispers was fracturing. Elias's temper grew violent. 2 field hands disappeared, rumored to have been sold to pay a gambling debt. The house became a place of tension, where every footstep could summon pain, every silence could mean death. Samuel's name appears less frequently in the overseer's diary after September of that year. Perhaps he was working elsewhere. Perhaps something was already being planned. What remains certain is this: before the blood spilled, before the wineglass tipped and the master fell silent, the people on that ledger had already begun writing a different kind of record. One carved not in ink, but in survival. Dawn began with sound. The crack of the overseer's whip, the clang of the iron bell, the barking of dogs. On the Givens plantation, morning was less a beginning than a command. The enslaved rose from their dirt-floor cabins before light touched the cypress trees, their bodies moving by instinct, their voices silent. By the time the sun crept above the horizon, they were already in the fields, bent low between rows of cotton that stretched toward forever. According to a slave schedule from the 1840 Mobile Census, the Givens property listed more than 60 enslaved persons, none recorded by name, only by gender and age. 5 infants under 1 year, 10 boys under 12, 14 women of childbearing age. In official ink, that phrase was meant to denote potential labor. In truth, it marked the brutal calculus of property reproduction. Birth was not joy, it was inventory. The rhythm of the day was relentless. Overseer Thomas Breedwell wrote in his July 1842 diary, "Work commenced at 4:30. Field hands expected 3 rows before breakfast. Correction for idleness, 5 lashes." The words are efficient, almost casual, as though suffering could be tallied beside yield. He mentions weather, yield, punishment, all in the same breath. Rain light, cotton fair. Girl Dinah reprimanded for delay. Elizabeth Givens, from her vantage in the big house, saw these rituals from the veranda. Neighbors later recalled that she sometimes turned away when punishment took place, a gesture of fragile mercy that changed nothing. On plantations like hers, silence was complicity. But the enslaved found language in other forms. The fields were alive with code. Songs drifted low through the air, melodies that seemed harmless to white ears but carried instruction, warning, or prayer. Follow the drinking gourd. Steal away to Jesus. These were not hymns alone, they were maps disguised as devotion. The stars became guides, the rivers pathways, and the music, the only form of communication the overseer could not fully control. At night, after the bell called an end to labor, the enslaved gathered quietly. Beneath the magnolias they built a world of their own, a shadow society that lived parallel to the masters. There they shared food when rations ran thin, tended to wounds, recited fragments of scripture that had been whispered from mouth to mouth since Africa. The invisible church, as abolitionists later called it, was where the enslaved remembered their humanity. The rituals were small, but they were everything. A stolen minute to braid a child's hair, a whispered prayer over a buried stillborn, a shared story of a land across the ocean where no one owned another soul. In 1937, the Federal Writers Project interviewed a woman known as Miss Lila, said to be the granddaughter of one of the Givens slaves. Her voice, recorded on fragile acetate, carries the rasp of age and memory. They didn't let us talk in the field. But when the horn blow for night, we talk in the dark. Talk soft like the trees listening. That's how they knew who was kin and who was gone. Silence became both shield and prison. Every gesture, lowered eyes, hands clasped, the choice to speak or not, was calibrated to survive another day. Samuel, now confined mostly to domestic duties, learned the art of invisibility. His hands built, served, and repaired, but his eyes recorded everything: the master's rages, the mistress's unease, the shifting loyalties of the household. He heard things meant not to be heard: the whisper of debt, the sound of the master's boots stumbling late at night, the soft weeping of a woman who understood that her comfort was built on chains. Every enslaved person carried a double consciousness, one self visible to the white world, another hidden deep within, fierce and untouchable. When Breedwell recorded disobedience, he meant that someone's hidden self had slipped through. And when the lash fell, it was not just punishment, it was a desperate attempt to break the invisible part that refused to die. Survival was resistance, but so was memory. They remembered the names of those sold away, repeating them like incantations so they would not be erased. They remembered faces, songs, recipes, dreams. On nights when thunder rolled in from the Gulf, the enslaved said it was their ancestors speaking back, reminding them that nothing built on cruelty lasts forever. By late 1842, a heaviness settled over the plantation. The crops thrived, but the people did not. Disease spread through the quarters. A child vanished. Rumors whispered of a curse, of the soil itself rejecting its harvest. Overseer Breedwell wrote tersely, morale low, spirit strange, songs darker. He did not understand that what he heard in those songs was prophecy, the quiet sound of a world beginning to turn against its master. And within that gathering storm of silence and song, one man and one woman, Samuel and Elizabeth, stood at its center, bound by roles written for them by others, yet slowly, dangerously rewriting the story themselves. Every tragedy has its quiet prelude, a moment that seems small at first, a splinter that festers until it poisons the entire body. For the Givens plantation, that moment arrived in late September of 1842, under a harvest moon so bright it made shadows look like ghosts walking the fields. According to a surviving fragment of the Breedwell diary, discovered decades later in a private collection at Spring Hill, the overseer wrote, "Household in disorder. Mistress withdrawn. Field hands uneasy. Master's temper most foul this week." The ink is smudged in places as if by a trembling hand or a spill. On the following line, a single entry, Dinah reprimanded in house, matter not to be recorded. Those 5 words, matter not to be recorded, are awound in the historical record. They appear nowhere else in Breedwell's meticulous notes, where every lash and loaf of bread was counted. Something happened in that house, something he dared not name. From fragments of oral history gathered a century later, a story emerges, fragile but insistent. In one account from the WPA slave narratives, an elderly woman named Sarah Jane R. remembered hearing her grandmother speak of a white man who went mad at the harvest, took what was not his to take, and paid in blood. The plantation was not named, but the description matches the Givens estate: the wide veranda, the magnolia grove, the mistress who played sad songs after dark. If we piece these fragments together, they suggest a familiar horror of the South, a horror repeated so often it blurred into the rhythm of life. Elias Givens, already known for his temper, is believed to have assaulted one of the women from the house staff. The name, though absent from any legal document, may have been Dinah, the same Dinah listed as a washerwoman on the estate inventory, the same who may have shared a family tie with Samuel. The violation would have shattered whatever fragile peace existed in that household. For Elizabeth, the wife, it meant humiliation not only as a woman but as an enforcer of a system that had turned her home into a theater of violence. For Samuel, it meant rage, not only for Dinah, but for every unspoken crime hidden beneath polite Southern society. In a letter preserved in the archives of the Mobile Historical Society, written by a neighboring planter's wife in October 1842, a single line hints at scandal: "The Lady G has fallen to melancholy. The Negro man never leaves the house now. Something dreadful has passed there." The tone is that of gossip, yet between the words lies genuine unease, the sense that something was unraveling in the genteel facade of the plantation world. It is here, perhaps, that the idea of retribution took form. Samuel's hands, long trained to craft and repair, would have known the household's every secret: the poisons kept for rats, the herbs used for fever, the decanter Elias favored every evening before bed. There is no document to prove when the decision was made, only the silence that follows the last entry in the overseer's diary that autumn: "The master ill-tempered. Quarrel in the night. No work tomorrow." Folklore fills what the records omit. One story, told by descendants of the enslaved community near the site, speaks of a night when the air itself turned red. They say the widow's candle burned past dawn, that her shadow moved across the parlor long after the master's voice had gone quiet. They say a man was seen walking toward the stables before sunrise and that the dogs, usually fierce, did not bark. In the world of slavery, rebellion rarely looked like open warfare. It moved in whispers, in glances, in choices so subtle they might be mistaken for obedience. But by October 1842, obedience had become impossible. Too much blood had soaked the soil, too many names had been struck from ledgers, too many women had borne the weight of their master's sins. The plantation stood like a loaded gun, elegant, silent, and seconds from discharge. Elizabeth, pale and withdrawn, avoided her husband's table. Samuel's eyes no longer met the overseer's. The songs from the quarters had gone low and mournful, like a warning to the dead. And somewhere in the walls of that house, a plan, or perhaps a destiny, began to take shape. The poison was already in the air, though no one yet knew whose hand would deliver it. When the frost finally touched the fields that November, the harvest was done. The cotton lay baled and silent in the barn. The night of reckoning had come to Mobile County. It was November 2, 1842, a night so still that even the crickets seemed to have forgotten their song. The moon hung thin and sharp over Mobile Bay, casting silver through the shutters of the Givens house. Inside, the table had been laid for 3, the master, his wife, and a guest who never arrived. Crystal glasses caught the lamplight. A decanter of imported claret gleamed like dark blood against white linen. According to the Mobile County Coroner's Ledger of 1842, filed under a section later half-burned by fire damage, the entry reads: "Elias Givens, white male, approximately 47 years, deceased by unknown means at supper. Found seated, hands clenched, face of unusual discoloration." The words "unknown means" were underlined twice. The next page, where a witness statement should have followed, is gone entirely. In the retelling that survives through oral history, the supper began in tense silence. Elizabeth sat opposite her husband, her eyes hollow from weeks of unrest. The enslaved man Samuel stood by the sideboard, as he had done 100 times before, waiting to pour the evening wine. But something about that night was different. The way Elizabeth's hand trembled as she lifted her glass, the way she kept her eyes fixed on the candle's flame instead of her husband's face. Elias had been drinking heavily for days, his temper sharpened by humiliation. He accused his wife of unnatural sympathies, a phrase that would appear later in gossip letters but never in court. "You care more for your dark-skinned servants than for your own house," he was said to have shouted that afternoon, slamming a ledger against the wall. By supper, his anger had softened into arrogance, the calm that often comes before cruelty. Samuel poured the wine slowly, steady as ever, his reflection bending in the decanter's curve. The records show that Elias preferred his glass full to the rim, his wife's only half. It was from this detail that later investigators, including one Reverend T. Holloway, writing in 1887, speculated that only one glass bore the taint. Holloway's pamphlet, God's Justice in the Swamp Country, claimed that arsenic, stolen from the plantation's rat poison supply, was ground fine as flour and stirred with sugar in the master's cup. At approximately 9 o'clock, according to the coroner's estimated time of death, Elias began to cough violently. The guest had still not arrived. A chair scraped. Glass shattered. Elizabeth is said to have risen from her seat, face drained of color, while Samuel rushed forward as if to assist, though some accounts whisper he only stood and watched. The master's body convulsed once, twice, then fell still. A streak of red wine darkened the tablecloth like a spreading wound. The lamp flickered low. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock and Elizabeth's shallow breath. When the overseer, Breedwell, entered minutes later, summoned by the noise, he found the mistress kneeling beside the corpse and Samuel standing behind her. Breedwell's written statement, preserved in part within the 1847 probate inquest, reads, "I saw no weapon. The master's eyes were fixed as if in great pain. The Negro appeared calm, which seemed to me suspicious. No mention was made of the untouched second glass or the faint, metallic scent that filled the room. Within hours, the house was sealed. The enslaved community was locked in their quarters. Breedwell sent a rider to fetch the county coroner from Mobile. But by dawn, the story had already begun to shift. Some said Elias had choked. Others said he suffered a seizure. The official verdict, cause undetermined, was recorded a week later, just before the page in the ledger turned to ash in the courthouse fire of 1849. The truth, however, refused to die. For decades, in the cabins that once dotted the plantation's edge, elders spoke of the night when the master's heart turned black as the wine he loved. They said the widow didn't scream. They said she simply stood and whispered something no one could hear, a prayer or a curse, it was never clear which. In the years that followed, Elizabeth Givens sold the estate. The enslaved people were dispersed, some to neighboring plantations, others vanished entirely from record. But in one surviving bill of sale from 1843, the name Samuel appears beside the word manumitted, freed. No reason stated. No signature by the widow. The last line in the coroner's fragment reads, "House sealed by request of the widow." It is not known who wrote it. What is known is that every subsequent mention of Elias Givens in Mobile Society pages ends abruptly that year, as though the town itself conspired to forget. History would later call it an accident. Folklore called it justice. The truth lies somewhere between, in a silence that still hums beneath the soil where the house once stood. The dawn that followed Elias Givens's death was not a sunrise, it was a reckoning. The mist that rolled in from the bay carried the smell of iron and something else, something faintly sweet and sickly, like the aftertaste of death itself. The body of the master lay cold in the upstairs chamber, yet the true violence was only beginning. According to the Mobile County Sheriff's Circular, November 4, 1842, a posse of 6 men rode out from the city before noon, to secure the premises known as Givens Plantation and to extract testimony from persons of color therein. The language, extract testimony, was the polite idiom for torture. By the time they arrived, the house was shuttered, the fields deserted. Elizabeth Givens, now a widow, met them at the door in a black dress not yet altered by mourning. The sheriff's report notes her demeanor as unnaturally calm. She insisted that her husband had fallen ill, that there was no foul play. But the men who followed the law in those days were not in search of truth, they were in search of someone to hang. By evening, 12 enslaved men and women had been taken from the quarters and bound for interrogation. Their names appear in fragments of the 1842 jail ledger, preserved in the state archives. Dinah, Ruth, Old Ben, Isaac, and Samuel among them. The entry for Samuel is marked with a small cross, a symbol used for prisoners held under suspicion of mortal crime. The next page, where his statement should have been, is torn clean out. Witnesses from nearby plantations later spoke of screams carried across the swamp that night. The overseer, Breedwell, was said to have overseen the questioning personally. In one undated note attributed to him, discovered decades later in the attic of his descendants' home, he wrote, "One of the women near broke under the lash but confessed nothing certain. The man Samuel would not speak even when the iron was shown to him." The iron referred to was the branding poker kept in the smokehouse, a tool of discipline repurposed for vengeance. By the second night, 3 of the enslaved had died under questioning. Their bodies were buried near the bayou without ceremony. The sheriff's account lists them simply as property deceased. The phrase is almost unbearable in its coldness, as if human beings could vanish into paperwork. As the violence spread, Mobile's newspapers began to fill with whispers. The Mobile Register, in its edition of November 6, carried a small notice on the second page, "Unfortunate occurrence on a local estate, poisoning suspected but unconfirmed. The widow declines to comment." By the next week, that line was gone, replaced by a simple death announcement. Someone had paid to make the story disappear. Still, rumors thrive in the dark. In nearby Baldwin County, enslaved communities began to sing a song they called "The Wine Turned Bitter," a mournful chant describing a master who drank his own cruelty. The refrain went, "He poured his wrath in a silver cup but it was his lips that drank it up." It spread quietly from camp to camp, until planters forbade its singing. Meanwhile, Samuel vanished from the official record. The sheriff's final note on him reads, "Removed by request of the widow." Removed where? Freed, hidden, sold under another name, no one knows. Some oral histories claim Elizabeth smuggled him north with the help of a sympathetic merchant. Others whisper that he was seen months later in New Orleans, working under an alias. The truth, like so many truths of that era, was buried beneath layers of fear and fire. The reprisals continued for weeks. Neighboring planters, terrified of rebellion, held midnight patrols. Whippings doubled. Curfews tightened. The Givens plantation, once a place of forced order, became a ruin of suspicion. Elizabeth withdrew entirely from public life, her shutters closed, her chapel draped in black. In January of 1843, the county finally declared the case closed, no person held to account. But the silence that followed was more damning than any trial. In every ledger, the lines where the Givens name should have appeared were smudged, erased, or rewritten in another hand. The estate's value was reassessed, its losses noted as unrecoverable. Folklore insists that the bayou behind the house ran red for days after the interrogations. "The ground bled," one descendant said in a 1930s interview, "and no seed would grow there for a generation." Whether true or not, the soil remembers what paper tried to forget. The Givens' death became another ghost in the archive, a warning whispered through the South's terrified plantations. When the tables turn, the house burns quietly. The trial of the state of Alabama versus Samuel, property of the late Elias Givens, began on January 14, 1843, inside the Mobile County Courthouse, a 2-story brick building whose iron shutters kept out both sunlight and mercy. There are few surviving records, only fragments of a court ledger, preserved in brittle condition, and a single newspaper column printed weeks later before the story was silenced. But what remains reads less like a trial and more like a ritual, a performance meant not to reveal the truth but to bury it. According to the Court Ledger of 1843, Volume 2, page 27, the proceeding opened with the reading of the coroner's report. The entry described the deceased as taken suddenly by ailment unknown, but under the pressure of the prosecutor, that phrase evolved into likely by poison, administered by a domestic. The transformation of those words marked the beginning of Samuel's undoing. He was brought before the bench in chains, clothed in rough linen, his wrists marked by the irons of confinement. The clerk described him as of mixed complexion, literate enough to read a psalm, bearing calmness unnatural to his station. The last phrase, unnatural calmness, would echo through the testimonies, a code for defiance, for dignity mistaken as guilt. The widow, Elizabeth Givens, was summoned but refused to testify. Her absence caused unease, her silence even more. A local paper, the Mobile Advertiser, later hinted at impropriety. The lady's loyalties appear divided, her health delicate, her testimony unnecessary. Behind those genteel words was the suspicion that the widow knew far more than she would ever say. The witnesses called were all white, overseers, patrolmen, neighboring planters, each one eager to prove loyalty to the social order that fed them. The overseer, Breedwell, testified first. His statement, preserved in partial transcript, reads, "I did observe the servant Samuel handling the master's decanter on the eve of the latter's passing. His manner was composed, too composed for innocence. I did see no act of malice, but the air was of guilt. The phrase, air of guilt, became the cornerstone of the prosecution. There was no physical evidence, no confession, no surviving poison vial, only atmosphere, suspicion, and the weight of racial hierarchy. The court allowed no counsel for the accused. Enslaved persons were not considered competent witnesses in their own defense. When Samuel was asked to speak, the clerk recorded only, "The prisoner said he had nothing to say to men who would not hear him." That single sentence, later struck from the official record, is the only surviving trace of his voice. Outside, crowds gathered along St. Louis Street, murmuring with a mixture of fascination and fear. For them, the trial was not about guilt or innocence. It was about restoring order. A white man of property had died by unseen hands, and the city demanded a sacrifice to steady the trembling balance of its world. After 2 days of proceedings, the jury, all planters, merchants, and overseers, delivered its verdict: guilty of conspiracy to murder, sentence of execution by hanging. The word conspiracy was a careful choice, a legal fiction that allowed the court to punish without admitting that a slave could act alone with cunning and intent. To them, rebellion had to be collective, not individual, for the idea of one enslaved man striking down his master in silence was more terrifying than an army in open revolt. The sentence was carried out at dawn on January 17, 1843, at the edge of the courthouse green. The sheriff's report states, "One Negro male executed before small assembly. Body interred beyond the city limits." But the date does not align with later census tallies, which still list one Samuel, colored, freed, living in Mobile County that same year. Historians have long debated the contradiction. Some believe the name was entered by mistake, others suggest that the execution never took place, that the record was falsified, and the man vanished with the widow's quiet aid. In a letter from Reverend Holloway to the Montgomery Presbytery, 1845, he hints cryptically, "The lady took pity on the soul of him condemned, and the Lord may have turned the key himself." The official record ends there. The last page of the ledger, warped and darkened by time, carries one unfinished line: "Case closed. Sentence satisfied." The ink trails off midstroke as if the clerk's hand had hesitated, as if even he could not bring himself to finish the lie. And so the trial that was meant to restore order became another ghost in Alabama's history, a proceeding that proved only one thing: that justice in 1843 was not blind. It had its eyes fixed firmly on the color of a man's skin. The truth about the Givens affair did not die with the master's body. It was buried, slowly and deliberately, beneath the ash of courthouse fires and the careful ink of revision. By the time the year 1849 arrived, the city of Mobile had grown fat from the cotton trade, its port choked with ships and its streets heavy with the perfume of sugar, sweat, and sin. But somewhere beneath that prosperity smoldered the remnants of a story the town wished to forget, a story that had once made even the proudest planter look over his shoulder at supper. The suppression began quietly, almost bureaucratically. The probate office of Mobile County issued an internal memorandum on April 3, 1843, ordering the reassessment and consolidation of several estate records, including those damaged or incomplete. Among them, estate of the late E. Givens, deceased. Within a month, the original inventory listing Samuel and Dinah's names was replaced by a fresh copy. This time, the name struck out and replaced by miscellaneous domestics, value adjusted. According to a surviving note in the county archivist's log, someone, initials E.G., personally supervised the redrafting. The irony is almost unbearable. The widow herself may have participated in erasing the very evidence that could have damned her or saved him. Then came the fire. Officially, it began on August 12, 1849 in the courthouse basement, sparked by an overturned oil lamp. But in a private letter written 2 weeks later by Deputy Clerk Thomas R. Pugh, he describes it differently. There was smoke before the lamp fell, and certain files already removed to the street before the alarm was raised. Pugh's correspondence, now held in the University of South Alabama Special Collections, never names which files burned first, but the loss was surgical. Gone were the coroner's ledgers from 1840 to 1843, the court minutes for the winter session, and the sheriff's prisoner logs. What remained were harmless things: land disputes, tariffs, marriages of white citizens. It was not the only fire. Similar blazes gutted courthouses across the Deep South in the decades to come, each one erasing the paper ghosts of violence. But the timing of Mobile's and the selectiveness of its destruction leaves little doubt. The Givens affair was purged by design. By 1850, the name Samuel appeared nowhere in county rolls, tax books, or parish ledgers. The widow Elizabeth, however, was still there, listed simply as Mrs. E. Givens, proprietress, 2 servants, no issue. She withdrew entirely from public life. Her last appearance in any document is in a Baptist church register of 1853, where she is noted as having donated for the restoration of church windows damaged by storm. Some historians believe the phrase damaged by storm may have been symbolic, a penitent gesture toward a past she could not cleanse. But the suppression was not only legal, it was social. In Moble's drawing rooms and parlors, a pact of silence took hold. No one mentioned the poison master or the hanging that may not have happened. To speak of it was to risk acknowledgement that the system itself, the whole brutal edifice of slavery, could be undone not by armies, but by a single act of defiance in a candlelit room. One clipping from the New Orleans Picayune, dated February 1844, carries a curious note. Visitors to Mobile report unease among its gentry. The matter of the widow and her servant is not to be discussed in polite company. The phrasing is restrained, yet the fear beneath it is raw. The story had already crossed the bay, whispered from dockworkers to travelers, carried in fragments like contraband. Still, whispers have a way of surviving what paper cannot. Among the enslaved communities who had once labored under Givens, the tale lived on in secret hymns and cautionary verses. They said the master's ghost wandered the bayou calling for wine, and that any man who answered him would die within the year. They said the widow's candle never went out, that it burned every night until the day she died. When historians returned to the courthouse ruins decades later, they found, beneath a layer of soot, the edge of a single charred document. The writing is faint but still legible in places, matter concluded by order of the court. Records expunged per directive. There is no signature, only a trace of red wax where a seal once pressed. The fire may have consumed the evidence, but it left behind its own confession, a silence too deliberate to be accidental. The South did not forget the story of the widow and the slave, it buried it alive. And somewhere, under the scorched stones of that courthouse, the truth still waits, blackened, breathing, and patient. Long after the ledgers were burned and the courthouse walls rebuilt, the story of the widow and the slave refused to vanish. It lived on, not in ink but in breath. In Mobile County, truth did not survive through scholars or scribes. It survived in the mouths of those who had no right to speak, passed down through nights of thunder, through the crackle of hearth fires, and through the trembling lullabies sung to children who would never know why their mothers wept when the wind blew from the east. Among the freed families who once labored on the Givens estate, the name itself became taboo. They called it simply, the house by the bayou, a phrase that appears again and again in late 19th century oral collections. According to an 1891 interview preserved in the Works Progress Administration Slave Narratives, one elder named Catherine Hill recalled, "My granny said there was a lady live down by the water, and one night her man died wrong. They said she had a light that never went out, and a man who walked with her shadow. They said if you saw that light in the trees, you best pray." It is tempting to dismiss such tales as superstition, but folklore has a way of guarding the truth that history is too ashamed to keep. Every detail carries a residue of memory. The light that never went out could only have been Elizabeth's candle, left burning in the master's room that final night. The man who walked with her shadow, Samuel, reimagined not as a servant, but as something far older and stronger, a ghost who chose to stay. In neighboring Baldwin County, another story took root. There people spoke of the wine turned bitter, a folk ballad said to have been first sung by field hands in the 1840s. The lyrics were simple, the melody slow and mournful. He poured his wrath in a silver cup, but it was his lips that drank it up. The lady wept, the fire cried low, and the bay took the body where no one would go. The refrain was outlawed by plantation overseers in the years before the Civil War, yet it survived, hummed under breath, disguised as a prayer. In the decades that followed emancipation, the story morphed again. In some retellings, Elizabeth and Samuel were lovers who fled together by boat under cover of darkness. In others, she died in her bed haunted by his ghost. By the time folklorists began collecting Southern oral histories in the early 1900s, the tale had become a warning told to brides: never drink from a bitter cup, lest the dead remember you. A 1937 field recording by the ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax includes a version of the song performed by an elderly woman from Daphne, Alabama, who claimed it came from her great-grandmother's time. Her introduction to the song is chilling. This one's about a white missus and a man who weren't free. They say God done mixed the colors that night, and the world turned quiet after. Even in silence, the community remembered. Some families refused to eat at a table set for three, a superstition rooted, perhaps unconsciously in that final dinner where death came as the fourth guest. Others would not light a candle after midnight, claiming it called The Lady from the Bay. Churches, too, carried fragments of the story in their hymns. The First Colored Baptist Church of Mobile, founded in 1868, kept a handwritten hymnal that included an anonymous verse. No master's lash, no master's name, but the Lord still see the flame. Below it, in faded ink, someone had written, For E&S, 1842. In a society that erased the evidence of their existence, the enslaved and their descendants built their own archives, made not of paper but of rhythm, rhyme, and inherited silence. What white Mobile tried to forget, black Mobile turned into myth, because myth was safer than truth. By the turn of the 20th century, the Givens name had all but vanished from official records. Yet the locals still swore the bayou near the old plantation was cursed. Hunters spoke of hearing a woman's voice calling for someone named Samuel. Children dared each other to walk to the water's edge on moonlit nights, saying the air would grow thick with the smell of wine. It is through these fragments, half memory, half haunting, that we glimpse what the archives destroyed. The story of the widow and her late husband's slave did not die, it adapted. It became folklore, and in doing so, it became immortal. Because when history burns its own evidence, the only record left is the ghost that refuses to be silenced. History prefers to call such things isolated incidents. That is how the Givens case was catalogued, when it was catalogued at all: a domestic tragedy, a disturbance of the peace, a peculiar event among a small household. But once you begin turning over the stones of the 1830s and 40s, once you read between the lines of plantation diaries and sheriff ledgers, you realize Mobile was not alone. It was part of a constellation of defiance stitched across the South, each spark trying in its own small way to set the night alight. According to the Louisiana District Court transcripts of 1839, a case was brought against an enslaved cook named Celine accused of poisoning her master's coffee. The file is brief, one page of accusations, no verdict recorded, and an annotation in another hand, case dismissed after property transfer. Historians later noted that within the same week, the plantation was sold to the overseer's cousin and the original family disappeared from parish records. Another erasure, another secret burial of truth. In South Carolina's Edgefield County, a coroner's report dated February 1840 describes a plantation blaze that consumed the main house, kitchens, and 6 slaves' quarters. The fire was declared accidental, but the very same week the Charleston Mercury carried an anonymous editorial warning against the rising insolence of domestics. Nothing connects these events in print, yet in the letters of a traveling merchant, preserved at the University of Virginia, there is a line that chills the reader even now. The slaves speak of a woman down by the Gulf, and they say she made the fire answer her. Whisper networks carried these stories faster than any newspaper could print them. Enslaved people traded fragments along the coast, at the markets, the river docks, the church gatherings under the pine trees. They spoke of the widow and the poisoned wine the way others spoke of Nat Turner's vision or the Louisiana conjure women. Theirs was an underground cartography of rebellion, traced not on maps but in rumor and song. The plantation owners feared these tales more than open revolt, for folklore needed no weapons. It gave the enslaved a vocabulary for defiance, a faith that vengeance was not impossible, only dangerous. When the masters mocked their prayers, they did not know those same prayers carried names. Names like Samuel and Elizabeth, murmured in candlelit cabins long after curfew bells. According to abolitionist William Wells Brown, who toured the Gulf Coast in the 1840s, there were rumors of women among the white gentry who had been undone by their own cruelties. His unpublished notes mention a mobile matron of fair countenance whose heart belonged to her husband's man, though he never gave her name. Brown understood that print was not yet safe for such truths, that publishing a story where love crossed the color line could endanger everyone still living within that world of chains. Patterns reveal themselves not in the headlines of the time but in the silences. Each missing file, each anonymous death, each entry rewritten to mask its cause points toward a collective strategy, not of armies but of individuals pushed to the brink. Between 1830 and 1850, the archives whisper of dozens of accidental poisonings, suspicious kitchen fires, unknown illnesses, among slaveholding families from Georgia to Texas. Historians have long debated whether these were coincidences or coordinated acts. But if one listens closely to the oral histories, the pattern sharpens into view. In the Federal Writers Project interviews of the 1930s, several former slaves recall hearing of the lady who turned against her own, or the missus who freed the wrong man. These testimonies, collected almost a century after the events, have been dismissed by scholars for their mythic tone. Yet myth, in a world built on censorship, is often the only record that survives. The widow of Mobile may have never met Celine of Louisiana, or the arsonist women of Edgefield, or the countless others whose names remain buried. But their choices, whether born of love, rage, or despair, echo the same rhythm, that of an enslaved world that refused to remain still. Each act, however small, chipped away at the myth of obedience that the slave system depended on. To read these fragments together is to realize that history did not unfold as the masters wrote it. It seethed beneath them, a network of fury, faith, and forbidden humanity stretching from the Carolina swamps to the Gulf waters. The Givens case was not a solitary tragedy. It was a verse in a longer, blood-soaked hymn of resistance. And though the documents crumble, the song remains, in every vanished name, in every whispered prayer, in every family who still refuses to speak of the night when the master's wine ran dark. The land forgets, but it never truly forgives. On the outskirts of modern Mobile, where housing developments now press against the remnants of swampland, the soil still breathes with secrets. Beneath manicured lawns and concrete driveways lie the same roots that once drank the blood of the enslaved, and though no marker bears their names, the wind seems to remember. It hums through the moss like the echo of a song too heavy to die. According to a 1904 land survey of Baldwin County, the property once listed as the Givens plantation was divided into 7 parcels. No mention of the main house remains, only a notation reads, "Foundations overgrown. Brick remnants near Bayou Edge." By then, Elizabeth Givens's name had vanished from all probate indexes. Her husband's estate was closed, her children, if she had any, absorbed into the wider white lineage of Mobile society. Samuel's name, predictably, appears nowhere. The only clue is a baptism record from 1843 for a child described as mulatto, name, Josiah, mother, unknown, father, deceased. The handwriting trembles as if the clerk himself feared the truth he was writing. When archaeologists surveyed the area in the 1970s, they found fragments of blue transferware china, iron shackles rusted to dust, and a single glass bottle, neck snapped clean, perhaps a wine decanter. Local workers whispered that the site was cursed. Machines broke down. A worker's arm was crushed under a fallen beam. One man refused to return, saying he heard a woman crying by the water, calling a name the wind swallowed. The ghosts of history are not metaphorical in the American South. They are geological. Every field hides its crime. Every river remembers its dead. And so the story of the widow who married her late husband's slave, whether history, rumor, or some blurred threshold between, lingers not as romance or scandal, but as a reckoning. A reckoning with what America buried beneath its own myth of civility. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth and Samuel's union ever took place, whether it was a desperate gesture of ownership, redemption, or love. What cannot be denied is that something happened in Mobile in the autumn of 1842, something powerful enough that every official record strained to conceal it. A poisoning, a death, a disappearance, a silence so total that it became suspicious. And yet the silence spoke. Through music, through whispers, through the defiance of memory itself. The story's persistence proves its truth in the only way that matters. Those who had everything to lose remembered it anyway. They told it in coded hymns, in fireside warnings, in the gentle curse of, "Don't drink the bitter cup." In the archives of the University of Alabama, a single loose leaf from an 1840s Mobile ledger lies misfiled under unidentified estates. It bears no full names, only initials. But under distribution of property, the word freed is written in the same hand that totals the debts. No reason, no signature. Just one word, freed. Some historians believe this may be all that remains of Elizabeth's final act. The man she once owned, liberated by her defiance or perhaps by her death. What makes this story so haunting is not its violence, but its possibility. That in a time when love was a crime and mercy a rebellion, a widow may have looked at the man the world called her property and seen something else. A reflection, a salvation, a final act of truth before the fire consumed them both. No matter how the tale shifts, whether it ends in marriage or execution, escape or ghostly reunion, it refuses to vanish. Like all buried truths, it seeps upward through time, staining each generation that walks above it. We inherit not the facts, but the feeling, the heaviness in the air, the strange quiet at dusk, the suspicion that someone, somewhere, still waits by the bayou for a name to be spoken again. And so, the widow of Mobile remains. Not in archives, not in court records, but in the collective marrow of a nation that still flinches at its own reflection. Her story, their story, is not over. It endures in the soil, in the silence, and in the song that hums when the night grows too still. Because history does not rest. It remembers even when we do not.